the only US president to replace and then be followed by the same person, and also uniquely the only president so far to be the grandson of a president, an abolitionist all his life. Today's history maker is the 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. Born in August 1833 on a farm near North Bend, Ohio, with a forebear who signed the Declaration of Independence and a grandfather who himself was president, Harrison grew up in Ohio. In 1847, he enrolled in Farmers College near Cincinnati, where he met his future wife, Caroline Lavinia Scott, who he would marry in 1853, and they would go on to have 2 children. Harrison studied law, and he moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, and established a law practice. He became a prominent local attorney, and he joined the Republican Party shortly after its formation in 1856. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued a call for more recruits to join the Union Army, and Harrison started recruiting throughout northern Indiana to raise a regiment. Harrison was then commissioned as a colonel. In May 1864, Harrison and his regiment joined General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, which brought Atlanta down, Harrison being among the initial Union forces to enter the surrendered city. Sherman stated that Harrison served with foresight, discipline, and a fighting spirit. He was very popular with his men and never asked his troops to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and would occasionally do some noble and inspiring things. He would surprise his men by just showing up in their tents with coffee and sometimes biscuits, which they hadn't seen in a commanding officer before. His message really was, "I'm not asking you to do anything I won't do myself." He ended up Brigadier General in the war and cited for bravery many times. He was in fact involved in 30 battles. Harrison held a dim view of the war, stating that he thought it was a dirty business that no decent man would find pleasurable. Later, in 1888, the year he would win the presidency, Harrison declared, "We Americans have no commission from God to police the world." Post-Civil War, Harrison resumed his law practice in Indianapolis. He became a skilled orator and known as one of the state's leading lawyers. He tried for governor a few times, but was not very successful. However, these were the days before the Senate was elected by the people. They were just appointed by the state legislature. So, when the Republicans win the Indiana legislature, he is appointed to the United States Senate, serving from 1881 to 1887. Harrison has a couple of causes which are interesting and unusual for the times. One is extending and preserving the rights of African Americans whose freedoms had been bargained away during the Reconstruction post the Civil War. The other major issue confronting Senator Harrison was the budget surplus. The Democrats wanted to reduce the tariff and limit the amount of money the government took in, while the Republicans instead wanted to spend the money on internal improvements and pensions for Civil War veterans. Harrison took his party's side and advocated for generous pensions for veterans and their widows. It also just happened that the largest political machine in the country with some 400,000 members, was something called the Grand Army of the Republic. These are veterans of the Civil War, and they're all Union veterans. Harrison actually achieved the passage of his dependent pension bill, only to see it vetoed by President Grover Cleveland. In 1887, largely as a result of Democratic gerrymandering, Harrison is defeated in his bid to be re-elected to the Senate. A year after this senatorial defeat, Harrison declared his candidacy for the Republican nomination. He dubbed himself a living and rejuvenated Republican. The initial favourite for the Republican nomination was the previous nominee, James G. Blaine of Maine. After his narrow defeat against Cleveland in 1884, Blaine became the front-runner for the 1888 contest, but he decided to remove his name from contention. Later, at the National Convention, which took place in June, Blaine threw his support to Harrison in the hope of uniting the party against President Cleveland. Nonetheless, the nomination fight that followed was hotly contested. Harrison was nominated as the party's presidential candidate only on the 8th ballot. Harrison's opponent in the general election was incumbent President Grover Cleveland. Republicans campaigned heavily in favour of protective tariffs, turning out protectionist voters in the important industrial states of the North. The election took place on Tuesday, November the 6th, 1888. It focused on the swing states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Harrison's home state of Indiana. The candidates split those 4 states evenly, with Harrison's victory in New York being particularly key and making all the difference between victory and defeat. Voter turnout was 79.3%, reflecting large interest in the campaign. Nearly 11 million votes were cast. While Harrison received 90,000 fewer popular votes in Cleveland, he carried the Electoral College 233 to 168. Benjamin Harrison was sworn into office on Monday, March the 4th, 1889. In a speech, Harrison credited the nation's growth to the influences of education and religion and promised a protective tariff. Harrison also urged early statehood for the territories and advocated pensions for veterans, a call that met with enthusiastic applause. Harrison acted quite independently in selecting his cabinet, much to the Republican bosses' dismay. The selections shared particular alliances, such as their service in the Civil War, Indiana citizenship, and membership of the Presbyterian Church. Nevertheless, Harrison had alienated pivotal Republican operatives from New York to Pennsylvania to Iowa with these choices and prematurely compromised his political power and future. This mistake would come back to bite him in the future election. Harrison quickly saw the enactment of the Dependent and Disability Pension Act in 1890, a cause he had championed while in Congress, providing pensions to disabled Civil War veterans. Pension expenditures reached $135 million under Harrison, equivalent of $4.4 billion today, the largest expenditure of its kind to that point in American history. The tariff levels had been a major political issue since before the Civil War, and they had been the most dominant matter of the 1888 election. The high tariff rates had created a surplus of money in the Treasury, which led many Democrats, as well as the growing populist movement, to call for lowering them. Most Republicans preferred to maintain the rates and spend the surplus on internal improvements and eliminate some internal taxes. It was at this time the federal budget hit the billion-dollar level. One unique thing about Harrison's time as president was that he was the first president to be elected after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. Harrison appointed several African Americans to government positions, including the first federal black judge, John Mercer Langston. Harrison would urge Congress to pass legislation that would secure all our people a free exercise of the right of suffrage and every other civil right under the Constitution and laws, and attempted to pass legislation to protect black Americans' civil rights, but ultimately a bill would fail to pass the Senate. Harrison would also turn the US into a major naval power. By 1898, with no less than 10 modern warships, including steel hulls and greater displacements and armaments, he had transformed the United States into a legitimate naval power. 7 of that 10 had begun during the Harrison term. 6 new states were admitted to the Union while Harrison was president. This was more states admitted than under any other president. The 1892 presidential election was a rematch of the 1888 campaign, with Cleveland once again Harrison's Democratic opponent. The Treasury surplus had evaporated and the nation's economic health was worsening, with the 1890 midterm elections going against the Republicans. Because he had failed to keep Republican bosses on side, he faced opposition to his renomination, even though he did prevail on the first ballot at the convention. The campaign was marked with tragedy when Harrison's wife, Caroline, succumbed to tuberculosis 2 weeks before the election. Cleveland ultimately won the election by 277 electoral votes to Harrison's 145, and he also won the popular vote by nearly 500,000. This was the most decisive presidential election in 20 years, with this time Cleveland taking both New York and Indiana. It gave Harrison the distinction of being the only president whose predecessor and successor was the same person. Harrison would die of influenza in 1901. Harrison's presidency gets major credit for innovative legislation in antitrust, monetary policy, tariffs, and the build-up of the Navy. His presidency was a time of great change and upheaval, and he played a significant role in shaping the course of American history. While being a one-term president, he may have had less influence on that history than some others. Benjamin Harrison is still a history maker.